Get your hands off my weapon or I will put you on the ground, General. Dead silence. 14 Navy SEALs stopped breathing. General Nathaniel Cross had just snatched the Barrett M82 from her hands, physically yanked it, and thrown it onto the table like garbage. This is not your range. This is not your mission. And you are not one of us. His face was 2 inches from hers. His finger jabbed her chest. Once. Twice. The room watched. Nobody moved. Nobody intervened. And Ava Reynolds stood there completely still, completely calm, and said, "Then let me shoot, and we'll settle exactly what I am." Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The briefing had been running for 47 minutes when the door opened. It wasn't a loud entry. There was no dramatic pause, no theatrical push of heavy metal hinges. The door simply opened the way doors open 1,000 times a day on a forward operating base, cleanly without ceremony, and a woman walked in. She was compact, medium height. She moved the way certain people move when they have spent years learning how not to be noticed, not timid, not apologetic, but economical. Every step placed with the kind of quiet precision that doesn't announce itself. She wore standard-issue desert fatigues. No unit patch on the left shoulder. No rank visible anywhere on her collar. Her hair was pulled back so tightly it disappeared beneath her patrol cap. And her face was the kind of face that gave nothing away. She simply walked to the back corner of the room, chose a position against the wall, crossed her arms loosely at her chest, and waited. For exactly 3 seconds, nobody reacted. 3 seconds is a long time inside a classified joint mission briefing room on a forward operating base in Kandahar province, Afghanistan. 3 seconds is long enough for trained operators, men whose entire professional existence is built around situational awareness, around noticing everything to process something unusual. And then those 3 seconds ended. "Stop." General Nathaniel Cross said the word the way other men might clear a room with a gunshot. Flat, absolute, final. He was standing at the head of the briefing table, a laser pointer in his right hand, a satellite image of a Taliban logistics corridor frozen on the screen behind him, and he said that single word, and everything stopped. The murmuring, the shuffling of papers. The low hum of the ventilation system seemed to quiet itself out of respect. He looked at her, she looked at him. "Who are you?" he said. No warmth in it, no curiosity, just the essential demand of a man who had spent 31 years deciding who belonged in rooms like this, and who did not, and who had developed over those 31 years an almost supernatural ability to identify the difference in under 10 seconds. "Staff Sergeant Ava Reynolds," she said. Her voice was level, not loud, not soft. It filled the space it needed to fill, and nothing more. Cross held the moment. He was 61 years old and looked like a man who had been carved out of something harder than most materials found in nature. His face carried the particular kind of weathering that belongs only to people who have spent extended time in desert environments, not just the sun damage, but something deeper. Something structural, as though the heat had slowly removed everything unnecessary from his features and left only the essential architecture of command. He had the Navy Cross. He had 2 Purple Hearts. He had led operations in 4 countries that would never appear in any public record. He was by any reasonable measure one of the most respected special operations commanders in the United States military. And he had never in 31 years had a woman walk into one of his Tier 1 briefings unannounced, without patch, without introduction, and tell him her name like that was sufficient explanation. "Reynolds," he said. The word came out like he was tasting it for poison. "What unit?" "I'm not at liberty to specify in an open briefing, sir." The room went very still. Master Chief Petty Officer Dennis Hargrove, who was sitting to Cross's left and who had served with him through 2 wars and a career's worth of classified operations, slowly set down the coffee cup he'd been holding. He did it carefully, like a man who senses something fragile in the air and doesn't want to be responsible for breaking it. Cross took 1 step around the head of the table. Just 1. Enough to close the distance between himself and the point of conflict without actually crossing the room. "You're not at liberty," he repeated. "No, sir. This is a closed briefing. Tier 1. Do you understand what that means?" "Yes, sir." "Then you understand that you don't get to walk into this room, tell me your name, and then tell me you're not at liberty to explain yourself. I understand that, sir. So explain yourself. She didn't move, didn't shift her weight, didn't glance around the room to gauge the reaction of the men watching her, and they were all watching her now. Every operator in that room, 14 men in various stages of pre-mission preparation, all of them with the focused, calibrated attention of people trained to assess threats. She just looked at Cross and said, "My orders don't permit me to disclose my assignment in an unsecured briefing environment, General. If you'd like, we can step outside." The silence that followed that sentence had a texture to it. It was the silence of a room full of men who had just watched someone decline to obey General Nathaniel Cross and had done so without raising their voice, without showing fear, without blinking. Petty Officer First Class Marcus Webb, who was 26 years old and had been a SEAL for 4 of them, and who considered himself reasonably good at reading situations, leaned approximately 2 millimeters toward the man beside him, Chief Petty Officer Dominic Rodriguez, and said barely audibly, "Did she just—" "Yeah," Rodriguez said. "That's yeah." Cross turned his head very slowly toward his aide, Lieutenant Commander Brian Sato, who was standing near the door with a tablet in his hands in an expression that suggested he would very much like to be somewhere else. "Sato," Cross said, "did you authorize this?" "Sir, I have a notification that came through approximately 20 minutes ago from SOCOM, but I wasn't able to 20 minutes ago." "Sir, the briefing was already in progress. I didn't—" "Sato." Cross's voice didn't rise. It compressed, which was somehow worse. "Tell me what the notification says." Sato looked at his tablet with the expression of a man reading a document he wishes he could unread. It says that Staff Sergeant Reynolds has been temporarily attached to this element for operational assessment purposes by order of Colonel James Whitfield, USASOC. The room changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but something shifted in the atmosphere the way pressure shifts before a storm, subtle, physical, unavoidable. Because Colonel James Whitfield, United States Army Special Operations Command, was a name that carried weight even in a room full of Navy SEALs. He was not a man who made casual assignments. He was not a man who paperwork shuffled soldiers into places as political favors or administrative accidents. But he was Army, and this was a Navy SEAL operation. And nobody in that room, not one person, could reconcile those two facts into something that made sense. Cross turned back to her. "Operational assessment," he said. "Yes, sir." "You're here to be assessed." "Or to assess, sir, depending on how things develop." Webb made a sound in the back of his throat that wasn't quite a laugh, but was its structural relative. Rodriguez put an elbow into his ribs before it could fully form. Cross walked back to the head of the table. He set the laser pointer down. He turned off the projector. He folded his hands in front of him and looked at Ava Reynolds with the specific expression of a man who has decided that a problem requires a different category of solution than he'd initially allocated. "Everyone else," he said, "take 15 outside." The room emptied with the efficient speed of people who understood that they were being dismissed from something they very much wanted to watch and who were calculating whether there was any position within the immediate area from which they could legally continue to observe it. There wasn't. Cross waited until the last man was out, until Sato had closed the door behind himself with the apologetic softness of someone who knew he was partially responsible for whatever was about to happen. Then it was just the two of them. Ava hadn't moved. Cross studied her for a long moment. Up close, she was younger than he'd initially registered, mid-30s. He placed her with the kind of physical stillness that reads as age from a distance but resolves closer into something else. Discipline. The stillness wasn't passive. It was active and controlled in the way that an undrawn bow is active. The tension is there, held deliberately. "How old are you?" he asked. 34, sir." "How long have you been in?" 12 years. "And in those 12 years," he said, "has anyone ever taught you that you don't walk into a Tier 1 SEAL briefing without an introduction?" "I was told my orders would arrive before I did, sir." Evidently, they were slightly delayed. "Slightly?" "Yes, sir." He pulled out a chair and sat down, which surprised her, not visibly, but somewhere behind her eyes something adjusted, reassessed. She'd expected him to remain standing, to use the physical geography of the room as leverage. The fact that he sat changed the register of the conversation. Sit down, Reynolds, he said. She sat. Tell me what Whitfield told you, he said. Not the official language, what he actually told you. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, he said this element was running a complex in 3 days and that they had a specific tactical gap in long-range observation capability. He said I was being sent to address that gap. We have snipers, Cross said immediately. You have SEAL snipers, sir. Is there a distinction you'd like to make? Colonel Whitfield seems to think so, sir. Cross leaned back in his chair. He pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of his nose and held them there for 3 full seconds, which was something he did when he was making a decision that he expected to regret, at least partially, regardless of which direction it went. What's your MOS? He asked. 18Z, sir. Special Forces, with additional qualification. What qualification? She said it simply without emphasis. SOTIC. The word landed in the room and sat there. Cross lowered his fingers from his nose. His expression didn't change in any dramatic way. He was too experienced for that, but something behind his eyes recalibrated. The SOTIC course. Special Operations Target Interdiction Course. The Army's most demanding sniper program. The failure rate was somewhere in the range of 60 to 70%, depending on the class and the people who attempted it, were not soft, they were experienced, motivated. Already selected operators who had already proven themselves at multiple levels before they ever walked through that door. The people who failed it were not failures. They were simply unable to meet a standard that most of the military world would consider aspirational, even as a goal. But he didn't say any of that. He said, that's Army. Yes, sir, I'm aware. We run a different system. I know your system, sir. He looked at her. I've spent the last 6 months at Bragg working with your community's training pipeline on a cross-qualification evaluation program. I know your system because I helped design the updated assessment parameters for it. The silence this time was different. It was the silence of a man who has just discovered that the game board has more pieces on it than he realized, and that some of those pieces were moved before he sat down to play. And Whitfield sent you here, Cross said slowly, because he thinks you're better than what I've got. Colonel Whitfield sent me here, she said, because he thinks what I bring might be complementary to what you've got, sir. Diplomatic. I'm trying to be. Cross stood up. He walked to the door, opened it, and looked out at the 14 men who had arranged themselves in the immediate vicinity with the unconvincing casualness of people pretending not to eavesdrop. Back inside, he said, all of you. They filed back in, and as they took their seats, they looked at Ava Reynolds, still in her chair, still giving nothing away, and every one of them was recalculating. Not dramatically, not with any expression that broke their professional composure, but the math was happening behind their eyes the same way it had been happening behind Cross's. Because Cross had stayed in the room with her, which meant he hadn't simply sent her away, which meant something had changed. Webb leaned toward Rodriguez again. What happened in there? Rodriguez shook his head slightly. Don't know yet. She's still here. I can see that. What does that mean? Rodriguez looked at Ava Reynolds for a long moment. She wasn't looking back. She was looking at Cross, who had resumed his position at the head of the table with the settled gravity of a man who has made a decision and is now executing it. She was watching him the way a person watches something they are trying to learn from, attentive and neutral and completely without hunger. It means, Rodriguez said quietly, that she said something worth listening to. Cross picked up the laser pointer. Reynolds stays, he said, not to her, to the room. A declaration of fact, not a subject for discussion. Nobody said anything. Then Petty Officer Second Class Jason Teller, who was 24 and the youngest man in the room and who had not yet fully learned the particular discipline of not saying the thing that forms most forcefully in your mind in a given moment, said, General, with respect, sir, what's her role? Cross looked at him, not unkindly, but with the directness of a man who has no time for questions that don't serve operational purposes. That's what we're going to find out, Cross said, tomorrow, at the range. And for the first time since she'd walked through that door, Ava Reynolds' expression changed. Not into anything dramatic, not into a smile, not into relief, not into satisfaction. Just the faintest, most controlled relaxation around her eyes, gone as quickly as it appeared, like a single ripple crossing still water. Because she had been ready for this moment for 12 years. and now it had finally arrived. Tomorrow. That night, the base didn't sleep the way bases usually don't sleep, in the particular managed restlessness of people who are trained to function on insufficient rest and who have gotten very good at performing normalcy even when something has disrupted their equilibrium. The generators hummed, the guard rotations turned, and the TOC analysts cycled through satellite feeds and signal intercepts, and the endless digital archaeology of tracking bad men through hostile terrain. And in the SEAL team's common area around a table, with the remains of a late meal and the concentrated attention of men who process uncertainty through conversation, the discussion that had been waiting since the briefing finally broke open. "Nobody here has heard of her," Webb said. He had his phone out, which was pointless. The network access on the FOB was restricted, and he wasn't going to find anything about a special operations soldier on any accessible channel, but the gesture of checking was still a kind of thinking. "Not one person." "That doesn't mean she's nobody," Rodriguez said. "It doesn't mean she's somebody either." "Sodic," said Petty Officer First Class Kevin Marsh, who was sitting at the end of the table and who had been quiet until now. He was 38 years old and had been in the community long enough to have a working knowledge of most of the major qualification programs across all branches. "If that's real," Webb said, "if it's real," Marsh continued without inflection, "that's not a paper credential. You know how many people wash out of that course? I've heard numbers. The numbers are worse than you've heard. I know guys, serious guys with multiple deployments, guys with quals coming out of their ears who didn't finish. Not because they cracked, but because the standard is just that precise. There's no give in it. You either hit or you don't, and at the distances they're working, the margin for error is measured in fractions of fractions." He paused. "If she finished that course, she's not someone you dismiss." The table was quiet for a moment. "She's Army, though," said Teller. "Special Forces," Marsh corrected. 18Z. That's the senior weapons sergeant designation in the SF pipeline. She's not a regular Army soldier who qualified on a sniper course. She's an SF operator who completed the most advanced sniper program in the military inventory." He looked around the table. "That combination, that's not common. That's not even uncommon. That's rare." "So why haven't any of us heard of her?" Webb pressed. "Because the people in that category," Rodriguez said, speaking for the first time in several minutes, "don't usually end up in the kind of places where you hear about them." He said it simply without drama, and it landed in the room with more weight than a dramatic statement would have, because it was recognizable as a specific kind of truth. The truth about the very top of any specialized field, where the work is so narrow and so sensitive that visibility is itself a liability. Webb sat with her for a moment. Then he said, "You think she's legitimate?" Rodriguez didn't answer immediately. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, looked at the table, looked at something past the table. Then he said, "I think the general didn't send her out of the room, and I've served with the general for 9 years. He sends people out of rooms." That was the end of the conversation about whether she was legitimate, but it was not the end of the conversation. "What do you think she's actually like?" Teller asked. "As a shooter." "Tomorrow," Rodriguez said. "Range? We'll know." "You think the general will actually put her through it head to head?" Rodriguez looked at him with the patient expression of a man explaining something to someone younger. "He already said range? You think he said range to be polite?" Teller considered this. "No. He said range because he wants to know. And Cross, when he wants to know something, he finds out." Rodriguez stood up, collected his coffee cup, and prepared to end the conversation the way conversations on FOBs always end abruptly, practically without resolution. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be something." He walked out. The remaining men sat in the particular quiet of people who have been told something important without being told exactly what it is, which is in many ways the defining condition of life. In special operations, the constant management of what you know and what you don't, and the specific discipline required to function effectively in the space between those two things. Webb looked at Teller. "You nervous about tomorrow?" Teller asked. "I'm not the one being tested tomorrow," Webb said. "Neither are we, she is." Webb nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said, but something about the way she looked at Cross when he said range, he stopped, shook his head. "What? Nothing, just..." She didn't look nervous, at all. Teller thought about this. Maybe she's good at hiding it. Maybe, Webb said. He stood up. Or maybe she's not nervous. He said it like it was the more unsettling possibility of the two, which when he thought about it later, it was. Ava Reynolds didn't sleep much that night, but not because she was nervous. She lay on the narrow cot in the room she'd been assigned, a spare room near the motor pool, which was where spare rooms always were on forward operating bases because space near the motor pool was the space nobody wanted. And she looked at the ceiling and she went through the mathematics of tomorrow, the way a pianist goes through a difficult passage the night before a performance, not with anxiety, but with the focused attention of someone who has done the preparation and needs only to run through the sequence one final time to confirm it is all still there. It was all still there. It was always all still there. She closed her eyes and saw not the ceiling, but a different sky, the enormous and indifferent sky above a Montana ranch, the sky of her childhood, which was the kind of sky that makes you understand early and permanently that you are small and the world is large, and the only things you can actually control are the things within the circle of your own precision. Her father had understood that, had built his entire philosophy of ranching and of life around that principle. You can't control the weather, Ava. You can't control the market price or the drought or the elk that get into the fencing. What you can control is your aim. Take care of your aim. Everything else you manage. She had been 9 years old when he said that. She had been standing in the field behind the barn with a .22 rifle that was almost too big for her missing targets, with a consistency that was in retrospect impressive only in its thoroughness. She had been 11 when she stopped missing. She had been 14 when her father stopped correcting her and started watching her, which was a different thing entirely, and which she had understood even then as a form of recognition she had not realized she was looking for until she found it. She had been 22 when her brother Daniel came home from Kunar province in a flag-draped transfer case, killed by a shot from a position that the subsequent after-action analysis placed at approximately 900 meters, fired by an insurgent whose identity was never confirmed. 900 meters. She lay on the cot and did not sleep, and thought about 900 meters and about what it meant and about the years between that day and this night, the enlistment, the pipeline, the qualifications, the course, the work, the unglamorous and grinding and relentless work of becoming someone who could stand at any distance in any conditions and narrow the entire world down to the space between the breath she released and the impact she controlled. Tomorrow they would put her on a range and they would judge her, and they would probably at least initially expect her to fail. She was not going to fail. Not because of pride, not because of any need to prove anything to General Nathaniel Cross or his operators or anyone else in that building, but because Daniel deserved better than to be commemorated by his sister's failure. She closed her eyes. The ceiling was dark. The generators hummed. Somewhere outside, a guard rotation was happening, and Staff Sergeant Ava Reynolds, 34 years old, SOTM, qualified 12 years in lay in the spare room near the motor pool on a forward operating base in Kandahar province, and did the only thing she knew how to do with certainty. She waited. Morning came the way mornings come in Afghanistan, fast, sudden, and immediately hot, as though the sun has been waiting just below the horizon with impatience, and rises not gradually but all at once, flooding the landscape with light that has no subtlety to it, no amber hour softness, just the immediate and declarative fact of day. Cross was already at the range when she arrived. He was standing at the firing line with Rodriguez and Marsh and two other operators she hadn't been introduced to, and he was holding a coffee cup, and he was watching her walk across the gravel toward them with the same assessing attention he'd had in the briefing room, but different now in its quality. Less dismissive, more interested. As though overnight the brief conversation that had sent his team to bed recalculating had done the same to him. She stopped at the line and looked at the range. It had been set up while she slept. Steel targets, humanoid silhouettes, roughly half-scale, the kind designed for long-range qualification. They stood at intervals. She had to squint slightly against the morning glare to fully distinguish, but she could read the distances, markers painted on the ground beside each target's stake. 800 meters, 1,200, 1,400. And at the far end, at the very limit of what the range could physically accommodate, given the terrain, a final target. 1,600 meters. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at Cross. "Good morning, sir," she said. "Reynolds," he said. Not unfriendly, not friendly either, just present, which was its own kind of respect she'd learned from men like him. Sleep well. Well enough, sir. Your weapon is in the armory. I had it brought over last night. He paused. Your equipment case. Thank you, sir. We're going to give you time to set up. When you're ready, you demonstrate. Nothing fancy, just hit targets. She looked at the 1,600-meter mark again. All four, as many as you can, Cross said. His voice was neutral, but she caught barely briefly a slight shift in Rodriguez's expression, a kind of internal attention that she read correctly as he thinks he knows how this ends. I'll set up, she said. She went to retrieve her case. Behind her as she walked away, Teller materialized from somewhere near the range shed and positioned himself beside Rodriguez. He did it with the studied casualness of someone who has thought about how to appear casual and slightly overshot it. 1,600 meters, he said low. I think Rodriguez said, watching her walk, that we're about to find out something. What? Rodriguez didn't answer immediately. He was watching the way she moved toward the armory, that same economy, that same deliberate placement of each step, the same thing that had nagged at him since the briefing room. The way she moved through space like someone who had long ago made peace with exactly how much of it she occupied and needed nothing more. I think, he said finally, that the general might be about to have a very educational morning. The armory door opened, and Ava Reynolds went inside to retrieve the Barrett M82. She came out of the armory carrying the case with both hands, and the moment the operator saw the size of it, the conversation stopped. Not gradually, immediately. The case was long, matte black, hard-sided with foam-padded latches along the top edge, in a carry configuration that required deliberate grip management, not because it was unwieldy, but because what was inside it had weight, and weight in a rifle case of that dimension meant one specific thing to anyone who knew what they were looking at. Webb saw it first. He was standing closest to the armory door, and he had to physically step back to give her room to pass. And as she walked by him, he read the case, the way operators read everything fast, instinctive, categorical. And then he turned to Rodriguez with an expression that had lost its earlier confidence and replaced it with something quieter. Rodriguez was already looking at the case. That's not a standard sniper package, Webb said. No, Rodriguez said. It's not. She carried it to the firing line and set it down with the controlled care of someone who has performed this exact action hundreds of times in dozens of conditions and has never once been careless about it. She knelt beside it, pressed the latches, opened it, and the Barrett M82 was there nested in its foam, broken down into its travel configuration, but unmistakable. The way certain things are unmistakable, not because of any single feature, but because of the total gestalt of what they are and what they represent. The M82, anti-material rifle. 50 caliber, a weapon designed not merely to reach long distances, but to be decisive at them, to make the argument of distance irrelevant through the application of physics and precision together. It was not a weapon you picked up because you were good at shooting. It was a weapon you picked up because you had moved past good, shooting into something that didn't have a casual name. The range went very quiet. Not the polite quiet of people being respectful. The instinctive quiet of people who have just recalibrated. Cross stood at the line and watched her begin the assembly process and said nothing. His coffee cup was still in his hand. He hadn't taken a drink from it in several minutes. Marsh moved to stand beside Rodriguez. He did it without speaking, which was its own communication. The two of them side by side watching the assembly with the focused attention of men who understood exactly what they were seeing and were taking the time to understand it fully before they said anything about it. Teller behind them said almost to himself, she brought an M82. Yes, Marsh said, to a sniper demonstration. Yes. That's a statement. Marsh looked at him. Everything she's done since she walked through that door yesterday has been a statement. Have you been paying attention? Teller had no answer for that. The assembly took her 4 minutes and 20 seconds. Cross timed it not consciously, but the way he timed everything, the internal clock that had been running since before he could remember, cataloging durations, the way other people catalog faces. 4 minutes and 20 seconds. Practiced. No hesitation, no second checking, no reference to any mental checklist. Pure muscle memory from a depth of repetition that produced a different quality of movement than competence. It produced automaticity, and automaticity in a weapon system of this precision told you something important about the person performing it. She stood, settled the rifle into its bipod position on the bench, ran a single check of the scope, a brief professional sweep, not the extended fiddling of someone uncertain, but the confirmation pass of someone who already knows what they're going to find and is simply verifying it. Then she straightened, turned, and looked at Cross. "Ready, sir," she said. Cross set his coffee cup down on the range table behind him. He walked to the line and stood beside her, not close, not crowding, but close enough that the conversation between them would stay between them. 800 first, he said. "Standard procedure. Work up." "Yes, sir." "You get 3 shots per target. If you miss all 3, I understand the procedure, sir." He stopped, looked at her. The edge in her voice wasn't disrespect, it was precision. The same thing, different application. "Then take your position," he said. She went prone behind the M82. The range went silent in the particular way that ranges go silent when something is about to happen that everyone present understands to be significant. It was not the silence of boredom or patience. It was the silence of held breath, of people suspending their own noise because noise felt in that moment like an intrusion. 800 meters. The first target stood in the morning heat, which was already generating the faint shimmer of thermal distortion across the desert floor. Not severe yet, not the wall of glass effect that full afternoon heat produced, but present, a factor, a variable that needed to be accounted for in the calculation between trigger and impact. Ava settled. Her breathing slowed in a way that was visible from behind the rising and falling of her back, became deliberate, rhythmic, and then it stilled. And in that stillness, she became less like a person and more like a piece of precision equipment that happened to be biological. She fired. The crack of the .50 caliber was physical. Not just audible, but felt in the chest, in the sternum, a concussive pressure wave that was the acoustic signature of a significant amount of energy moving very fast through air. It was not a sound you got used to exactly. You accommodated it the way you accommodate any recurring fact of your environment, but it never became nothing. 800 meters downrange, the steel target rang. The sound of it, that flat resonant clang of .50 caliber against steel at distance, arrived approximately 2 seconds after the shot carried back across the desert on the ambient air. But everyone on the line heard it, and everyone on the line understood what it meant. "Hit," said the range officer unnecessarily. Nobody responded. They were watching Ava. She hadn't moved, hadn't lifted her head, hadn't shifted position, hadn't done any of the small celebratory or relieved things that most shooters do after a first hit on a new range and new conditions. She was still there, still behind the glass, already adjusting for the next shot, with the methodical calm of someone for whom a hit at 800 meters was not an achievement worth noting. It was simply the baseline, the floor, the beginning of the conversation, not the conversation itself. Webb looked at Rodriguez. Rodriguez looked at the target. Neither of them said anything. She fired again. Hit. Same target. Tighter than required. She fired a third time. The third shot landed within a spread that Marsh, standing with his arms crossed, measured with his eyes, and then looked away from without comment. But his jaw had shifted. The particular set of his jaw had changed in the way that a man's jaw changes when he has seen something that requires him to adjust his framework. "Move to 1200, Cross said. She didn't respond verbally. She made the adjustments, scope, position, breath, with the same unhurried precision, and then settled again into that stillness that was becoming for the men watching less a shooting technique and more a kind of identity. 1200 meters. The thermal distortion was more present now. The sun had climbed. The desert floor between the firing line and the target was moving in the way desert air moves when heated from below, the slow visual ripple that plays tricks with distance and makes precision at range exponentially more demanding than the raw number suggests. At 1200 meters in these conditions, you weren't just shooting at a target, you were solving a dynamic equation in real time. And the equation had variables that changed between the moment you read them and the moment the bullet arrived. She fired. Hit. The clang came back across the distance and landed among them like a fact they hadn't fully expected. "How?" Webb said very quietly to no one in particular. Nobody answered him because nobody had the answer, and in that particular group, nobody was going to offer a theory they weren't certain of. Cross had not moved from his position beside the line. He was watching her with the focused, stripped-down attention of a man who has set aside every prior conclusion and is working from raw observation, which was anyone who knew him would tell you an extremely rare mode for General Nathaniel Cross to operate in. He was not a man who easily released his frameworks. He had built them over 31 years, and they had served him and his people well, and he did not abandon them casually. But he was watching Ava Reynolds shoot, and something in what he was watching was doing something to his frameworks that he could feel and could not yet name. She fired twice more at 1200, both hits. The grouping at that distance in those conditions with that weapon was the kind of grouping that people who evaluate such things write reports about. Marsh was evaluating it with his eyes and the slight forward lean of his posture, and what his posture said to anyone reading it was, "This is not normal." 1400, Cross said. She made her adjustments. Rodriguez behind her said quietly to Marsh, "You've run the SEAL sniper course. What's the longest confirmed hit in the program's history?" 1350, Marsh said. "One guy, one time. Conditions were near perfect." Rodriguez looked at the 1400-meter marker. "Conditions aren't near perfect today." "No," Marsh said. "They are not." She fired. The wait for the impact sound at 1400 meters was long enough for people to breathe, to shift weight, to feel the specific suspense of a distance that is not theoretical but actual, a distance that takes time to cross, that exists as a real interval of space through which a projectile must travel, while the air does what air does, and the heat does what heat does, and the physics of the situation conduct their indifferent business. The clang arrived. It was slightly different at this distance, flatter, more attenuated, as though the sound itself had used some of its energy getting back to them, but it was unmistakable. "Hit." "Oh," said Teller. It was a single syllable. It contained approximately 40 different things, and none of them were mockery, and none of them were doubt, and all of them were the particular sound a person makes when they are in the process of revising a significant assumption about the world. Cross turned his head and looked at his team. He looked at all of them one by one, the brief inventory-style assessment that was one of his signature behaviors. Then he turned back. "Reynolds," he said. "Sir?" 1600 is at the end of the range. Wind is variable. Thermal distortion is significant. I want you to take your time." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How much time do I have, sir?" Cross almost said something. He caught it. Whatever it was, almost a laugh, almost something that wasn't command-bearing. He contained it, and what came out instead was, "As much as you need." She looked downrange at the 1600-meter target. From where she was lying, and it was very small. Not invisible, but small in the way that things are small when the distance between you and them is so significant that it begins to feel abstract, conceptual, a number, rather than a place. Most people, even people who understood riflecraft intellectually, could look at a target at 1600 meters and feel the distance in their body, the sense of the improbability of it. The physical intuition that told them the space between here and there was too large for precision. That precision belonged to close things, and this was not close. Ava didn't feel that. She had trained herself out of it, or maybe she had never had it, had grown up on enough Montana distances under enough Montana sky that enormous space was simply the normal condition of the world. And the question was never whether you could reach across it, but only how carefully you prepared for the crossing. She settled in. The team watched. What happened next was that nothing happened for a very long time. She lay behind the rifle, and she did not move, and she did not fire, and the seconds accumulated into a minute, and then past a minute, and nobody on the line spoke. Not because they had been told not to. Cross hadn't said anything about it, but because the quality of her stillness was such that introducing noise felt like it would constitute a kind of interference, the way you don't speak loudly near someone performing surgery or diffusing something. Webb, after 90 seconds, leaned to Rodriguez and put his mouth close to his ear and said, barely a breath, "What is she doing?" Rodriguez just as quietly, "Waiting." For what? Rodriguez watched her for another moment. Watched the way she was watching, not the target he realized, but the space between herself and the target. The air, the distortion, the wind. "For the right second," he said. The wind that had been moving across the range in its inconsistent, variable way did something that wind occasionally does. It paused. Not completely, never completely, but it found a momentary equilibrium, a brief settling, a gap in its own restlessness. She fired. The sound of the M82 at full power was significant. It was always significant, but this time in the silence that had built around her stillness, it was something more. It was an event, a punctuation mark at the end of a long sentence. And every person on that range felt it in their chest and held what they were feeling and waited. 1,600 meters. The sound of the impact when it came took more than 4 seconds to travel back. 4 seconds is a long time. Long enough in that particular silence for several of the men present to have a thought they would later be reluctant to describe, because describing it would require admitting that they had, for one unguarded moment, hoped she would hit. Not because they had suddenly decided she deserved to be there. Not because their framework had fully shifted, but because they were watching something, and the thing they were watching had a specific quality. And when something has that quality, you find yourself hoping it completes itself, the way you hope a difficult piece of music reaches its final note. The clang arrived. Flat, attenuated, real. Direct hit. Nobody spoke for 3 full seconds. Then Rodriguez said, barely above a whisper, a single word: damn. Cross was standing at the line and his arms were at his sides, and he was looking downrange at the 1,600-meter target, and his face was doing something it almost never did in front of his team. It was showing him thinking. Not the performance of thoughtfulness, not the managed display of a commander considering options. Actual thinking. The visible processing of a man whose data set has just changed in a way that requires structural revision. Marsh said to nobody in particular, "I need to know her win call on that shot." "Her win call," Webb said. "She waited for a gap, but a gap isn't zero, it's reduced. She still had to calculate what was left. At 1,600 meters, a 10-mile-per-hour crosswind moves the bullet approximately." He stopped, ran the math in his head. 32 inches off center. If she misjudged the residual wind by 2 miles per hour, she's off by 6 inches. The target is 18 inches wide. He looked at where the shot had landed, center mass. She didn't misjudge. "How?" Webb said again. The same word he'd used at 800 meters, but with a completely different emotional content now. Earlier, it had been skeptical. Now it was something approaching genuine bewilderment. "That's the question," Marsh said. Cross turned from the range. He turned and he looked at his team, and he looked at all of them, and then he looked at Ava, who had come up from behind the rifle and was now seated on the bench beside it, not triumphant, not performatively modest, just present, the same way she had been present in the briefing room, occupying exactly the space she occupied and requiring nothing additional. Cross walked to her. He stopped 3 feet away and looked at her, and she looked at him. "Where did you train for this?" he asked. "Montana, sir, initially." "Montana. My father's ranch. He started me on long guns when I was 9. She paused. He believed in taking the time to learn something correctly once rather than quickly twice. Cross was quiet. Something moved through his expression that was not quite an emotion, but was the outer edge of one, the visible border of something he was not yet prepared to name. "After Montana," he said. "Bragg, Fort Benning, isolated locations I'm not at liberty to specify, and the SOTIC course, sir, which you already know about." "Who was your SOTIC instructor?" "Master Sergeant Franklin Reed." The name registered on Marsh's face. Cross didn't look at Marsh, but he caught the register in his peripheral vision. Reed. Franklin Reed, who was arguably the most demanding and most respected sniper instructor in the Army Special Operations System, and who was known among the people who knew him for a simple and unwavering standard. He passed people who were ready and failed, people who were not, and he made no exceptions for rank, branch, gender, or reputation. You were either ready or you were not, and his assessment of the difference was uncanny in its accuracy. "Reed passed you," Cross said. It wasn't quite a question. "Reed passed me with a commendation, sir." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence from all the previous ones. It was the silence of a room, or in this case, a range in which a specific and final fact has just been stated, and everyone present is integrating it, and the integration is not comfortable because comfort is not what accurate information always produces. Cross looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned to his team, all of them arrayed behind the firing line, some of them still looking downrange at the 1,600-meter target, as though the fact of the hit was something they needed to keep visually confirming. Hargrove, he said, Master Chief Hargrove, who had been standing at the back of the group with his arms crossed and his face arranged in the specific expression of a man who is not surprised but is nonetheless impressed, said, Sir, what is your assessment? Hargrove was quiet for a moment. It was the deliberate quiet of a man choosing his words with the same care a good shooter chooses his moment, not hesitation, but precision. My assessment, he said, is that I have been on ranges with some of the best shooters in this community for 22 years. And what I just watched, he paused. I've seen it twice before. Both times it was from men who had spent their careers doing nothing else. He looked at Ava. She's doing something else too, and she shoots like that. Cross nodded once. Minimal, a commander's acknowledgement. Then Webb, who had apparently reached the end of his capacity to contain his reaction, said, General. His voice was different than it had been, not the casual, lateral tone of a man among his peers, but something more careful, more considered. I owe Staff Sergeant Reynolds an apology. Cross looked at him. Last night, Webb said, at the table, I said things I wouldn't say to her face. He looked at Ava directly. I'm saying them to your face now. I was wrong. I should have been better. It was not a small thing for Webb to say. Everyone present understood that. In a culture where admission of error was valued but rare, where the pride of operators ran deep and sometimes ran ahead of their honesty, what Webb had just done required something specific that not everyone in that community could access on demand. Ava looked at him. Thank you, she said. Not coldly, not warmly either. Simply. The word had its full weight and nothing added to it. Rodriguez behind Webb said quietly, for what it's worth, same. Then tell her. Same. Then one by one the others. Cross watched it happen. He watched his team, his Tier 1 SEAL team, the most highly selected and decorated and demanding group of operators he had ever commanded, do the thing that the best teams do when confronted with the truth. They adjusted. Not dramatically, not with any performance of humility, but genuinely, practically, in the way that professionals adjust when reality provides them with data that requires it. He was proud of them for it. He would not say so directly, that was not his style, but he felt it. Then he looked at Ava Reynolds. And he said the thing he had been working towards since the briefing room, since the coffee cup, since the 4-minute assembly and the 800-meter hit, and all the distance up to 1,600 in the wind gap and Reed's commendation and every other data point that had been accumulating since she walked through that door without rank visible and without explanation and with the particular stillness of someone who knew exactly where they were going and had decided long ago that the opinions of people who didn't yet know that were a problem they could manage. He said, Staff Sergeant Reynolds, what do you need from this element to do your job? She looked at him. For the first time since she had arrived on the FOB, something shifted in her expression that was more than the controlled micro-adjustments he'd been catching at the edges. Something opened briefly, genuinely, the way a door opens in a house that has been closed for a long time, and the air moves differently when it does. Coordinate access, she said. Real-time weather data at altitude. A spotter I can trust. And the general's confidence, sir, if he's willing. Cross held her gaze. The first 3, he said, I can give you today. She waited. The coordinate, he said, you've already earned. Somewhere downrange, the 1,600-meter target stood in the desert heat steel and still bearing the mark of a shot that most people in that world would spend their careers hoping to make once. She'd made it on demand in conditions that argued against it in front of people who'd been certain she couldn't. And she hadn't flinched, not at the setup, not at the weight of being doubted, not at the distance, none of it. Because she had learned a long time ago on a ranch in Montana under an enormous and indifferent sky that the only thing that lived between you and the target was the quality of your preparation and the honesty of your stillness. Everything else was just win, and she had been routing wins since she was 9 years old. The walk back from the range was quiet. Not the uncomfortable quiet of men who don't know what to say, but the specific quiet of people who are processing something significant and need the silence to do it properly. 14 operators and 1 general and 1 woman who had just done something at 1,600 meters that most of them would spend the rest of their careers measuring other things against, and none of them were ready yet to reduce it to conversation. Cross walked ahead. Not far, not dramatically, just enough to establish that he was thinking and that the thinking required space. Rodriguez fell into step beside Ava without making a production of it, the way you fall into step beside someone when you've decided quietly and without announcement, that they've earned the proximity. "Reed," Rodriguez said after they'd covered about 50 meters. "Sir." She looked at him. Rodriguez wasn't a sir. He was a chief, but she'd been raised in a culture where respect defaulted upward until told otherwise, and she hadn't yet been told otherwise. "Chief," he corrected without sharpness. "You can call me Chief, and I'm not asking officially. I'm asking because Franklin Reed trained two people I know personally, and both of them are," he paused, selected the word carefully, "singular. There's no other word for it. And I want to know what he told you that was different from what he tells everyone else." She was quiet for a moment. They walked. The gravel crunched under their boots in the heat. "He didn't tell me anything different," she said. "He told me the same things he told everyone. Breath control, natural point of aim, reading environmental variables as a continuous process rather than a fixed pre-shot calculation." She paused. "The difference wasn't what he told me. It was what I already knew when I arrived." "Montana," Rodriguez said. "Montana," she confirmed. He nodded, didn't push further. Some things you either understood from lived experience or you didn't, and Rodriguez was experienced enough to know which category he was in and to respect the boundary of the other. Behind them, Webb and Marsh were walking together, and the conversation they were having was lower in volume, but not lower in intensity. 32 inches, Marsh said for the third time. He kept coming back to it the way a tongue comes back to a sore tooth, not because the return was productive, but because the fact required repeated contact to fully believe. At 1600 with the residual wind she had to calculate 32 inches of drift and then adjust for the gap timing and then fire in the window. "That's not," he shook his head, "that's not a skill you train. That's a skill you develop over years of doing nothing else." "She did 12 years, Webb said. "She did 12 years of SF. That's not the same as 12 years of nothing else. She had other responsibilities, other training, other demands, and she shoots like it was nothing else." He looked at the back of her head as they walked. "I want to know what her range time looks like, how many rounds a week, what her training log says." "You think she'll tell you?" Marsh considered it. "I think she'll tell me exactly as much as she decides I've earned, not more." "That's fair," Webb said. "Yeah," Marsh said. "It is." They reached the TOC building and Cross stopped at the door and turned around. He looked at all of them. The inventory looked quick and total. Then he said, 1 hour, mission briefing, full detail. "Reynolds, you're in." He looked at her directly. "Not as a guest, as a member of this element." He went inside before anyone could respond. The team stood in the heat for a moment. Then Teller said to no one in particular, "Did the general just—" "Yes," Rodriguez said. That was yes. "Okay," Teller said. He seemed to be working through several emotions simultaneously and had chosen to manage the traffic by reducing his vocabulary to single syllables. "Okay." Ava looked at Rodriguez. "Do I need anything specific for the mission briefing?" "Bring your brain," he said. "That seems to be your best piece of equipment." It was the first thing anyone on the team had said to her that was unambiguously warm, and it landed in her chest in a way she didn't let show, but registered completely. "I'll go clean the rifle first," she said. "Good habit," Rodriguez said and walked inside. She stood for a moment alone in the heat. The sun was fully up now. The desert operating at its full thermal register, the air above the gravel doing its slow wavering dance. She looked at the case in her hands. The M82 broken back, down nested back in its foam patient, the way tools are patient, ready, always ready, waiting for the next time it was needed. She thought about Daniel. Not deliberately. She never thought about him deliberately. That was a door she opened only when she chose to. And she almost never chose to in operational environments. Because operational environments required the kind of clean, forward-facing attention that grief made difficult. But sometimes he arrived without being called the way certain memories do, and she had learned not to fight that when it happened. He had been 26 when he died. He had been in country for 8 months. He had been, by every account she'd been able to find in the years since, an exceptional soldier respected by his team, trusted by his chain of command, the kind of person that the people who served with him described consistently and without apparent coordination, using the same word steady. He had been steady. She carried that word the way she carried the M82 carefully with both hands, with full awareness of its weight. She went inside to clean her rifle. The mission briefing 1 hour later was different from the one she'd interrupted the previous day in every way that mattered. She had a seat at the table, not the back of the room, not a corner, a seat, with the team with her name on the position marker that Sato had placed with the slightly over-formal efficiency of an aide who was working hard to correct for yesterday's failures. Cross ran the briefing with the same precision he brought to everything, which was the precision of a man who had spent 3 decades learning that imprecision in planning produced imprecision in execution, and imprecision in execution produced casualties. And he had seen enough casualties to have strong feelings about imprecision. The target was a Taliban logistics facilitator operating out of a compound in Helmand province. His name was Khalid Nasrallah. He was mid-level in the network's hierarchy, not the top, not the bottom, but a critical node, the kind of operational connector whose removal didn't end the network, but degraded it significantly and bought time for the next phase of action. He moved regularly, kept irregular schedules, and had survived 3 previous interdiction attempts by a combination of good intelligence and the specific bad luck of the operations trying to reach him. The compound sat in the valley, high ground on 3 sides, 2 exits, both of which were observed. A pattern of life analysis suggested he was present between 0200 and 0600 local, which meant the operation window was narrow, and the movement to get in position had to happen before midnight. The problem, Cross said, putting a laser pointer on the satellite image, is overwatch. The high ground here, he indicated a ridge, is the natural observation point, but it's also the obvious one, which means it's watched. The approach to get a shooter on that ridge without being observed requires coming in from the north face, which adds approximately 4 kilometers to the movement, and requires crossing terrain that is, he paused, challenging. At night, he looked at Ava. What's the distance from the north face approach point to a viable firing position on the ridge, he asked. She had been studying the image since he put it up. She'd been doing the geometry in her head, the way she did everything quietly without running the numbers through the part of her brain that had been doing this for so long. It felt less like calculation and more like intuition, though she knew the intuition was just calculation that had internalized. Depends on the firing position definition, she said. If we're talking optimal, a position with full line of sight to the compound's primary access point, and the secondary exit you're looking at roughly 700 meters from the compound. But the north face approach puts you in position about 1 kilometer back from there, and the terrain between is, she looked at the image. What's the elevation change? Sato pulled up a topographic overlay. She studied it for 4 seconds. 60 meters of elevation gain over that final kilometer. Moving quiet at night with gear that's 90 minutes minimum. Probably closer to 2 hours if the ground is what this topo suggests. The room was quiet for a moment. Hargrove said, she's right on the timing. Cross looked at Hargrove. I ran a similar approach last year. Different valley, comparable terrain. 2 hours is accurate if you're moving correctly. He paused. Moving correctly meaning slow enough not to be heard. Cross nodded, returned to Ava. The window opens at 0200. If you insert at 2200 and need 2 hours to reach position, I'd be on the ridge at midnight, 2 hours of observation time before the window opens. That's workable. She paused. I'd need the weather data for the valley at elevation and a spotter who knows how to move in that terrain. Rodriguez, Cross said immediately. Not a question. Rodriguez from his seat said, I'm in. Ava looked at him. She registered something, not surprise, but the particular quality of attention that comes when someone does something that recalibrates your assessment of them. Rodriguez had just volunteered to move through 2 hours of challenging night terrain to act as spotter for an Army SF shooter he'd met less than 24 hours ago. That was not a small thing. That was the kind of thing that told you something essential about a person's character, that they were capable of setting aside the categories they'd been raised in professionally and making decisions based on what was actually in front of them. Thank you, Chief, she said. Don't thank me yet, he said. I haven't seen the terrain up close. There was a moment of low laughter from around the table, brief, genuine, the kind that breaks tension without dismissing it. Cross let it settle and then continued. He walked through the rest of the elements, positioning the exfil plan, the contingencies for each of the 3 most likely ways the operation could go sideways. He was thorough in the way that came from having lived through the consequences of incompleteness, and the team followed with the alert, absorptive attention of people who understood that every detail in this room was a potential life or death variable downrange. Ava absorbed everything. She had a small notebook, a physical one-paper, which she knew was slightly anachronistic in an environment saturated with digital systems, but which she preferred for the specific reason that writing things by hand embedded them differently than typing. And she made notes that were minimal and coded more trigger words than records, because the actual information was going into the part of her mind that held operational data and held it reliably. Toward the end of this briefing, Cross said questions. It was not quite an invitation, it was more a formality. The standard close of a briefing that was asking the room to either surface what it needed to surface or accept that the plan was complete. Usually at this point, the questions were logistical. Gear specifics, comms frequencies, exfil timing. Teller raised his hand, the slightly awkward gesture of a young operator who hadn't yet fully shed the habits of formal education, and said, "General, the spotter-shooter pairing. Reynolds and Rodriguez have never worked together. In a time-sensitive window, that's a variable." It was a reasonable point. It was the kind of thing someone said when they were genuinely thinking about the operation's success, rather than about anything else, and Cross recognized it as such. "Reynolds," he said. She looked at Teller, not at Cross, at Teller, because Teller had asked the question and deserved to have it answered to his face. "In SOT, I see." She said, "The final field evaluation pairs you with a spotter you've never worked with." Deliberately, because the course philosophy is that a shooter at the qualifying standard should be able to establish effective communication with any competent spotter within the first 15 minutes of working together. She paused. "Chief Rodriguez is beyond competent. I'll know what I need to know about his communication style before we're halfway up that ridge." Teller nodded slowly. "How?" "By listening," she said. "It's the same skill as shooting. You get quiet, you pay attention to what's actually there, and you respond to that instead of to what you expected." The room was quiet. Then Hargrove, from his position at the back, said something that he said rarely. Something that came out not as a formal assessment, but as a genuine, unguarded reaction. Where did she come from? It wasn't a question. It was the slightly bewildered statement of a man who has spent 22 years believing he had a comprehensive map of the landscape and has just found a feature on it that wasn't on any version he'd previously seen. Cross heard it. He didn't respond to it directly, but the corner of his mouth moved in a way that on his face constituted the equivalent of a full smile on anyone else's. The briefing closed. The team dispersed to their pre-mission routines, gear checks, physical prep, the quiet personal rituals that experienced operators develop over time to manage the transition between planning and execution. These rituals varied widely. Some men cleaned weapons again, even when they had already been cleaned. Some men slept. Some men wrote things, letters, notes, things they didn't intend to send, but needed to put somewhere outside themselves before they walked into an operation. Ava went to the small room near the motor pool and sat on the cot and did none of those things. She sat with her back against the wall and her hands in her lap, and she thought about the operation the way she thought about long shots, not as a single event, but as a sequence of connected decisions, each one leading to the next, each one dependent on what had come before and what was coming after the whole thing, a chain that was only as strong as the decision-making at each individual link. 700 meters, in a valley at night, with a 2-hour approach and a 2-hour observation window, and a target whose patterns were never fully predictable. She had shot longer. She had shot in worse conditions. She had shot with less preparation and less intelligence and less time. But she had never shot with this much at stake in terms of what the shot meant beyond the shot itself. Because this was not a qualification course and this was not an evaluation. This was real, and the thing you hit or missed at the end of it was not a steel target that rang or didn't ring and then stood there waiting for the next round. She was aware of that wait. She let herself feel it for exactly as long as it was useful to feel it, and then she put it in the same place she put everything that couldn't help her in the background, accounted for but not running the foreground, present but not in charge. Then Rodriguez knocked on the open door. She looked up. He was standing in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee, holding one out toward her, with the straightforward generosity of someone who has decided to skip the intermediate steps of social calibration and simply be direct. She took it. He leaned against the door frame and drank his own and didn't say anything for a moment, which she appreciated. She had been around enough people who used silence as a prompt, who let it build until the other person felt compelled to fill it. Rodriguez wasn't doing that. He was just drinking coffee in a doorway, comfortable with the quiet. You worried about tonight, he asked. Just that, direct. No, she said. He nodded. I didn't think so. He drank. You worried about anything? She considered the question honestly. It was a better question than it might appear on the surface because what he was really asking was, not are you afraid, but is there any operational variable that you haven't fully solved for, and that's sitting in the back of your mind making noise? The exfil timing, she said, if the window runs long and daylight catches us on the north face. I've already talked to Cross about adding a contingency extraction point at the base of the ridge, Rodriguez said. He's adding it to the plan. She looked at him. When did you do that? While you were getting coffee. He paused. I figured you'd have the same concern. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, how did you know? Because it's the right concern, he said simply, and you strike me as someone who tends to have the right concerns. It was she realized one of the more precise compliments she had received in her 12-year career. Not the right answer, not the right shot, the right concerns, the right things to think about in the right order with the right weight assigned to each. Thank you, Chief, she said. Rodriguez, he said, or Dom, either one. We're going up a ridge together tonight. You can use my name. Rodriguez, she said, because that was what he'd offered first, and she was someone who defaulted to what was offered. He nodded, started to leave, stopped. One more thing, he said. He reached into the cargo pocket of his fatigues and brought out something small, held it in his palm, looked at it for a moment before he turned his hand to show her. It was a small tactical insignia, a pin. He was holding it carefully the way you hold something that has specific weight, not physical weight, but meaning weight, the accumulated significance of what a thing represents. She looked at it and something moved through her that she didn't immediately identify because the pin was not unfamiliar. She knew what it was the instant she saw it. She had one of her own in her kit wrapped in a small piece of cloth that she kept it in when she wasn't wearing it because the circumstances in which she wore it were specific, and this hadn't yet been one of them. But what Rodriguez was holding was not hers. Where did you get that? She asked. Her voice was careful. Hargrove, Rodriguez said. He noticed it in your kit when the armory brought your case over last night. He paused. He didn't go through your kit. The case was open when they logged it. He saw it. She looked at the pin. The SOTIC qualification pin. Not the course certificate, not the paperwork, not the commendation from Read the Pin. The small, specific physical thing that you received at the end of the course when they told you that you had met the standard. It was not worn commonly. It was not displayed. Most people who had it kept it exactly the way she kept it wrapped in something in a kit private. Not from shame, but from the particular relationship that serious practitioners have with their serious credentials. They know what the credential means, and they don't need anyone else to see it for it to be real. Why is Hargrove holding it? She asked. He's not holding it, Rodriguez said. I am, and I'm showing it to you because... He stopped, chose his words with the same care he used for everything. Because this afternoon before the briefing, Hargrove went to Cross, and he told Cross that he'd seen this. And Cross didn't say anything for about 30 seconds, which for Cross is basically a geological era. He paused. And then Cross said, and I'm quoting directly, make sure she knows we saw it. She looked at the pin in his palm and then looked up at him. Cross wanted me to know that he saw it, she said slowly. He wanted you to know that he understands what it means, Rodriguez corrected. There's a difference. She knew the difference. The difference was everything. You could see a credential and see only its surface, the name of the course, the difficulty of the standard, the objective fact of having met it. Or you could see what it represented in terms of the life it took to get there, the years, the losses, the specific impersonal fire that a person walked into and was shaped by and came out of carrying something that couldn't be faked or shortcut or achieved by anything other than being exactly who you needed to be and doing exactly what needed to be done. Cross had seen the second thing. She took the pin from Rodriguez's palm, turned it over once in her fingers, looked at it in the way you look at something that has been with you long enough to become part of your definition of yourself. Tell Hargrove thank you, she said. You can tell him yourself, Rodriguez said. You're at the table now. He left. She held the pin in her hand for a long moment after he was gone. Then she set it on the cot beside her and looked at it, and she thought about the morning she'd received it, the end of the course. Reed standing in front of the class with the particular expression of a man who has just finished demanding the best from people and found it, which was an expression she had only ever seen on the faces of people who truly loved what they did. And she thought about what she'd felt in that moment, which was not pride exactly, not relief exactly, but something underneath both of those things, something quieter. Like she had finally finished building a sentence she had started on the day Daniel didn't come home. She picked the pin up, and for the first time since she had arrived on the FOB, she put it on. Not on her collar, not visibly, not as a display. She pinned it to the inside of her jacket against the fabric where it sat against her chest, and she could feel its small weight and know it was there without anyone needing to see it. Then she lay back on the cot and closed her eyes and ran the ridge again in her mind. 60 meters of elevation, 90 minutes to 2 hours in the dark, a valley below, 700 meters to the compound, a window that opened at 0200. She ran it until it was smooth, until every variable she could anticipate had been given its place in the sequence, and every contingency had been assigned its response. And the whole thing moved in her mind the way a well-practiced piece of music moves, not perfectly, never perfectly, because the terrain would have its own opinions and the night would have its own agenda, but with enough structure to absorb the disorder and still arrive where it needed to arrive. Outside, the base was shifting into its pre-operation rhythm, the particular heightened efficiency of a unit that has a mission in less than 12 hours and has activated the part of itself that exists specifically for this, the part that is most alive when the stakes are highest. She felt it through the walls. She had always been able to feel it, the charge in the air before action, the specific quality of collective attention that a team generates when it is preparing to be excellent together. She had never been on the inside of that feeling with a team like this. She had been adjacent to it, parallel to it, occasionally in proximity to it. But Cross had put her at the table. Rodriguez had brought her coffee and told her to use his name. Hargrove had noticed her pin and told Cross, and Cross had made sure she knew what seeing it meant. She was not outside the circle anymore. And in 4 hours, when darkness was full and the temperature had dropped and Rodriguez knocked on her door with his gear on, and that specific readiness in his eyes that good operators get when the thing they've been built for is finally in front of them, she would walk out of this room and into the operation, and she would do what she had spent 12 years preparing to do. Not for Cross, not for the team, not for recognition or redemption or any of the things that people who didn't understand this life imagined it was about. For the shot, for the precision, for the small, specific, irrefutable truth of the round going exactly where she sent it. For Daniel. Always for Daniel. Rodriguez knocked at 2,145. She was already up, already dressed. The M82 was broken down and packed, the case sealed, her kit assembled with the particular economy of someone who has run enough operations to know that everything you carry is weight, and weight is a decision, and every decision you make before you step outside the wire either helps you or costs you later when you are tired, and the terrain is arguing with you, and there is no good time to regret what you packed. She opened the door, and Rodriguez was standing there in full kit nods up on his helmet rifle, slung the expression on his face that she had already begun to recognize as his operational face. Not different from his regular face in any dramatic way, but quieter, more concentrated, the way a lens looks different when it's actually focused on something versus when it's just pointing in a direction. He looked at her kit, one sweet professional assessing. "Good on," he said, "just that." "How's the team?" she asked. "In position. We move in 10. Cross wants a radio check before we step off." She picked up the case. "Then let's not waste the 10. They moved through this FOB toward the staging area, and the base at this hour had the specific quality of a place operating in 2 registers simultaneously, the visible surface of normalcy, generators running, guards posted, the administrative machinery of a military installation, cycling through its routines, and underneath that, invisible to anyone not part of it, the coiled readiness of a team that was 40 minutes from stepping outside the wire into the dark. Cross was at the staging area with Hargrove and Sato. The rest of the element was arrayed around them in the organized, unhurried way of people who have done this enough times that the pre-mission ritual has become as natural as breathing. Gear checked, comms tested, contingencies, confirmed, the whole structure of preparation completed, and now simply being held, waiting for the moment to move. Cross looked at Ava when she arrived, not the assessing look of the briefing room or the range, Something more direct than that, something that had the quality of a commander looking at a member of his element before a mission, seeing them not as a problem to be solved or a capability to be evaluated, but as a person who is about to go into something dangerous and who he is in some functional sense responsible for. "Reynolds, he said. "Sir, Rodriguez will be on your left at all times on the approach. If the terrain forces a split, you maintain radio contact every 4 minutes. If contact breaks for more than 8 minutes, you pull back to the contingency extraction point and wait." He paused. "That's not a suggestion." "Understood, sir. Your window is 0200 to 0530. If the target doesn't present in that window, we extract clean," she said. "No improvisation." Cross looked at her for a moment. "Who told you that's my rule?" "Nobody, sir. It's my rule, too." Something moved in his expression. Brief, then radio check. Sato ran the check. All elements confirmed. The night was clear, which was both an advantage and a complication. Clear nights in the Afghan desert meant better visibility for movement, better conditions for shooting, and also better conditions for being seen by anyone who was looking. The nods helped. Discipline helped more. At 2200, Cross said, "Move out," and they moved. The first kilometer was relatively straightforward, flat approach terrain, the kind that your body manages without significant complaint, where you can establish your pace and your breathing and your noise discipline and get into the rhythm of night movement before the terrain starts making demands. Rodriguez set the pace and she matched it, and within the first 10 minutes, she understood something about him that she hadn't been able to read from a table or a range he moved well. Not just competently, but with the organic efficiency of someone for whom outdoor movement at night with weight was a deeply ingrained physical vocabulary. His steps were placed, not random. His pace varied with the terrain in the automatic way of someone whose body had learned the calculus of movement across irregular ground. She filed that away. "Good spotter, moves well, will not be a problem on the approach." They didn't talk. This wasn't an agreement they'd made explicitly. It was just the natural outcome of two people who understood noise discipline, operating in an environment that required it. The communication that happened was physical, small directional gestures, a raised fist for pause, an open hand for slow, a single finger pointed for obstacle. The language of people who have learned to coordinate without words. At the 40-minute mark, the terrain changed. The north face of the ridge began to assert itself, and the flat approach became something else. A climb steep enough to change the breathing calculus, rocky enough to require foot placement attention, long enough that the weight she was carrying started having opinions about the proceedings. The M82 case across her back added its argument to every step. She managed it. She had managed worse. Montana winters had given her a physical baseline that most people who'd grown up in flat, temperate places didn't have the specific endurance of someone who learned early that the land does not accommodate you, and that accommodation flows in one direction only. Rodriguez paused at a rock outcropping and turned, checked her position, confirmed she was close, and made the 4-minute radio call in a voice so low it was barely above a breath. "Element 2, checkpoint Alpha, on schedule, out." Cross's voice came back just as quietly. "Copy, continue." They continued. At the 90-minute mark, they were 2/3 up the ridge, and the exertion had settled into the particular managed discomfort of sustained physical effort in cold air. The body had made its adjustments, found its steady state, and was now simply executing. Her mind had cleared in the way it always cleared when her body was working hard. The cognitive noise that accumulated during planning and waiting and interpersonal friction burned off in the metabolic demand of movement. And what was left was clean, specific attention to exactly what was in front of her. She was thinking about the shot. Not obsessively, not in the anxious, repetitive way of someone trying to pre-solve an unsolvable problem, but in the way a musician thinks about a difficult passage on the walk to the performance, holding it lightly, letting the preparation do its work, trusting that when the moment arrived, the sequence would be there. Rodriguez stopped. She stopped instantly, 2 paces behind him. He held up a fist. She held. He was listening. She could see it in the quality of his stillness, the slight tilt of his head, the way his weight had settled back onto his heels, slightly redistributing to reduce foot noise. 30 seconds. Then he turned, leaned toward her, and said, at a level that was not quite sound, "Movement left 100 meters." She had already heard it. A displacement of gravel, the kind that could be animal or could be human, and in this terrain at this hour, the distinction mattered enormously. They held. 60 seconds, 90. The cold worked its way through the fabric at her collar. The sound did not repeat. Rodriguez looked at her. She made a small gesture continue, and he turned, and they moved again, slower now. More deliberate, the remaining third of the climb accomplished it in the specific mode of people who have been reminded that the environment is not neutral. At 2,347, they reached the firing position. Rodriguez confirmed it with a brief radio call while she began the process of setting up M82 out of the case, assembled in the dark with a speed and silence that would have surprised people who hadn't watched her at the range bipod. Deployed scope calibrated for the ambient conditions. A calculation made and verified, and made again for the distance, the elevation differential, the temperature, the density altitude. 720 meters to the primary access point. She had pasted on the topo and confirmed it with the rangefinder 720, which was well within the M82's effective range in these conditions, well within her demonstrated capability, but also not a trivial distance at night with a human target in a valley that had its own microclimate and its own wind behavior that might be meaningfully different from the conditions at ridge level. She communicated all of this to Rodriguez in the low, precise shorthand of an established shooter-spotter pair, and he received it and processed it and confirmed it and added his own observations. Wind direction from the valley floor, observed through the thermal scope, slightly different from ridge 2 to 3 miles per hour from the southwest, a factor she needed to incorporate. She incorporated it. Then they waited. Waiting is its own discipline. Most people who haven't done it don't understand this. They think of waiting as the absence of activity, as the nothing between the somethings. But operational waiting, the kind of waiting that happens in a hide site with a weapon and a target location and a window that hasn't opened yet, is profoundly active. You are monitoring, you are adjusting, you are managing your body's request for movement, for warmth, for the relief of change position against the operational requirement of stillness. You are maintaining the state of readiness that allows you to move from zero to full execution in the time it takes to recognize a trigger event. Ava was good at this, better than good. She had a capacity for operational stillness that Rodriguez noticed within the first 20 minutes of their wait and filed away in the part of his mind that kept records of things he'd seen that were genuinely unusual. He had waited on targets with some of the best operators in the SEAL community. He knew what good looked like. What she was doing was different, not in any show-off way, not in any way she was performing, but in the organic, unself-conscious way of someone for whom this particular mode of being had become the most natural mode available. At 0147, 13 minutes before the window opened, the compound showed its first activity. A light. Interior. Moving, not fixed, which meant handheld, which meant someone was awake and moving inside the compound. Rodriguez called it in a breath. Activity, interior light, moving. She was already tracking through the scope. Confirmed, single source. Moving toward primary access. Could be security rotation, Rodriguez said. Could be, she said. Watch for pattern. They watched. The light reached the primary access point and stopped. A door opened. A figure emerged. She tracked it immediately, maintained the track with the smooth, patient continuity of a shooter who has learned that you don't acquire and lose and reacquire. You acquire and holding is the work, and the work is not dramatic. Single male, she said. Armed, light build, not the target profile. Agreed, security. The figure completed its circuit and returned inside. The light disappeared. Rodriguez exhaled. Not yet. Not yet, she confirmed. 200. The window opened. Nothing happened. This was the part that movies never showed, the way an operation could be perfectly planned and perfectly positioned and perfectly ready, and then simply have to wait because the target was a human being with autonomous behavior and not a scheduled event, and human beings with autonomous behavior didn't always coordinate with operational windows. 215. Nothing. 216. Rodriguez shifted his weight slightly, the first movement either of them had made in 43 minutes, and she felt rather than saw it and understood it not as impatience, but as the body's necessary management of sustained cold and static position. You doing okay? She asked barely above a breath. Fine, he said. You fine. 247. The compound moved again. Not a light this time. A door, the primary access point opening without the preliminary interior light that had preceded the security rotation earlier. And the figure that emerged was different build, different movement profile, different posture. She had the target photos committed to memory with the specificity of someone who understands that recognition at distance is a skill that has to be built in advance because the moment of recognition is not the moment for learning. Movement, as she said. I see it, Rodriguez said. Profile match, she said. Height, build, gait. Confirm before you call on them. I know, she said. Steady, not defensive. She watched. The figure moved into the compound's exterior area, and she tracked it, and she ran the profile comparison in the part of her mind that did that work. Height against reference points she'd already identified. Build against the intelligence photos. The specific way this person held their shoulders, which was a thing that photographs captured, and that people couldn't fully disguise because posture was older than awareness. It's him, she said. Rodriguez was quiet for 2 seconds. The 2 seconds of a man running his own confirmation. Confirmed, he said. Calling it in. He keyed the radio. Control element 2, target acquired, awaiting authorization. Cross's voice came back in 4 seconds. Element 2 control, authorization granted, you are cleared hot. And everything became very simple. This was the thing about the moment before a shot, all the complexity that preceded it all. The planning and movement and waiting and calculation collapsed into a single point of simplicity. There was the trigger. There was the target. There was the distance between them, which was not a problem, but a fact, and facts were manageable. Everything else that existed in the world, the ridge, the cold, the dark, the 14 operators positioned elsewhere in the valley, Cross at the TOC, Daniel in his grave in Montana, 12 years of every range and every course and every qualification and every moment of doubt from people who looked at her and saw only what they expected, all of it receded to a distance so far that it might as well not have existed. There was only this. She settled into her breathing, felt the rhythm of it, found the space between the exhale and the next inhale, that brief biological pause where the body is perfectly still because it has released one breath and not yet begun to demand the next. Rodriguez gave her the final wind call. She had already made it. They matched. She placed the crosshairs, and she waited for one more thing. Not hesitation, not doubt, the specific alert patience of someone waiting for the precise right moment within a window of right moments, because the target had moved slightly, was moving, and moving targets required a different calculation than static ones. And the calculation was running, and she was waiting for the output. The figure paused. A natural pause, the pause of someone who has stepped outside and is orienting, taking in the night air, doing the small human thing of standing still for a moment before moving again. She fired. The M82 spoke with its full authority, and the sound of it on that ridge in that dark valley was enormous and irreversible. And then it was over, and the interval between the shot and the impact was a duration that contained for the people experiencing it approximately the weight of everything. The figure went down. Rodriguez said, impact, target down, confirmed. And then immediately, with the professional speed of people who understand that a shot means the clock has restarted. Control element 2, target neutralized, beginning exfil. Cross copy element 2, clean exfil. Well done. She was already breaking down the rifle. 4 minutes and 18 seconds. 2 seconds faster than the assembly. The hands knew what to do and did it without asking the mind for permission. And the mind was already on the next problem. The ridge descent, the extraction point, the 2 kilometers back to the vehicle pickup, in the dark with the valley below, now fully alert to the fact that something had happened. Rodriguez was up and moving toward the descent route, and she was behind him with the case, and they moved in the particular mode of people exiting a hide after a shot fast but controlled noise. Discipline relaxed because noise discipline at this point was less important than distance. The priority having shifted from undetected to away, which required a different calibration. They were 400 meters down the ridge when Rodriguez stopped hard. She stopped, held. He turned, his expression even in the Nadi's green light was visible. Something had changed in it, something that wasn't the operational calm of 3 minutes ago. Radio's down, he said. She felt the cold move through her that was not from the temperature. Since when? I don't know. Last confirmed comms was the neutralization call. He tried again. Static. I've got nothing. She checked her own. Same static. The rock composition of it, she realized the specific geology was blocking transmission in a way that the planning had not fully accounted for, and they were in a dead zone and the element below had no confirmation of their position or their status. The contingency extraction point, she said immediately. 300 meters north from here, he said. Switchback route adds 15 minutes. Then we go north, she said. If we can't raise comms by the time we're at the contingency point, we'll have line of sight to the valley from there. Comms will come back. He looked at her for 1 second. The second of a man assessing whether the person beside him is right or whether they are simply confident in determining which one it is. North, he said. They moved north. The switchback added 12 minutes, not 15. Rodriguez moved faster when he was worried, she noted, which was a useful thing to know about a person, and when they cleared the rock formation that had been blocking transmission and hit the contingency extraction point, Rodriguez keyed the radio immediately. Control Element 2 had comms blackout at contingency extraction. Status 4 seconds. Then cross Element 2 control. We lost you for 11 minutes. What's your status? Full strength. Both personnel awaiting extraction at contingency point. A pause that contained something. She could hear it even through the radio compression, the specific quality of a commander who has been in 11 minutes of operational uncertainty about 2 of his people, and is now hearing that they are okay and is managing his response to that information in front of a team that is watching him manage it. Copy Element 2, extraction en route, ETA 14 minutes. Good work tonight. Rodriguez lowered the radio and looked at her. 11 minutes, he said. I know. Cross doesn't do well with 11 minutes of silence from his people. I know, she said again. Rodriguez made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in that family. He's going to have things to say when we get back. Probably, she said. You ready for that? She looked at him. In the green light of the nods, his face was the face of a man who had just done something difficult, well alongside someone he hadn't known 48 hours ago, and who had reached the end of that experience with a specific kind of regard that was different from the regard you had for people you'd known a long time. It was sharper, more earned. The kind that came from watching someone function under actual pressure, in actual conditions, and finding that they were what they appeared to be. Cross can say what he needs to say, she said. We completed the mission. The target is down. Everyone is coming home. Rodriguez nodded slowly. You know what the hardest thing about being a commander is? She waited. It's the 11 minutes, he said. It's always the 11 minutes, the part where you don't know. And you have to function like you know because the people around you need you to, but you don't. He paused. Cross has been doing that for 30 years. That's a lot of 11-minute stretches. She thought about that, thought about Cross in the TOC, watching the radio. His face doing the thing it did when it was actually thinking rather than performing thought. The man who had grabbed her arm and pointed her toward the door and called her irrelevant, and who had also 11 minutes ago sat in silence, not knowing if she was alive and managed that silence with the discipline of 30 years. People were complicated. She had always known this, and knowing it had not always made it easier to navigate. But there was something in this particular complexity that she could respect even given everything. I know, she said. I do know. The extraction vehicle appeared 14 minutes later, exactly when Cross had said it would, moving without lights across the valley floor to the contingency point, and when it stopped, Rodriguez opened the door and she got in, and the door closed, and they were moving, and the ridge above them receded into the dark behind the vehicle. She held the M82 case across her knees in the vehicle and looked at the dark rushing past and felt the specific exhaustion of a completed operation. Not physical exhaustion only, but the decompression of every system that had been running at full capacity for the past several hours, the gradual release of the sustained tension that operational readiness required. Rodriguez beside her said nothing for the first 5 minutes of the drive. Then he said, You know what I'm going to tell Cross when we get back? What? That you were exactly what you said you were. He paused. Nothing more, nothing less. She turned to look at him. That's all any of us can be. She said. Yeah, Rodriguez said, but not all of us are. The vehicle moved through the dark toward the FOB, and somewhere in the valley behind them, the compound was fully activated now. Lights and movement and the organized response of people who had just experienced something irreversible. And none of that touched the inside of the vehicle, where two operators sat with the particular settled quality of people who had done the thing they went out to do and were coming back whole. At the gate, Cross was waiting. Not inside, not at the TOC. At the gate itself, which was not standard, commanders did not wait at gates. They received reports in command spaces. They maintained the physical and psychological position of people who are above the operational detail. But Cross was at the gate, standing with his hands at his sides and Hargrove beside him. And when the vehicle stopped and Rodriguez got out, Cross looked at him and then at Ava. And the look he gave her was not the look he'd given her in the briefing room or at the range or in any of the moments that had preceded this one. It was simpler than all of those, stripped of the complexity of assessment and doubt and professional pride and institutional framework. He looked at her the way you look at a member of your team when they come back from something. "Reynolds," he said. "Sir," she said. "Good shooting." 3 words, 2 syllables each. The most efficient version of what they contained, which was the acknowledgement of a commander who has been wrong about a soldier and knows it and is not the kind of man who dresses that acknowledgement in language it doesn't need. She held his gaze. "Thank you, sir," she said. And that was enough. That was exactly enough. The debrief happened at 06:30. Cross ran it the way he ran everything, methodically, without wasted language, moving through the sequence of the operation from insertion to extraction with the focused attention of a man who understood that the after action was not a formality, but the mechanism by which an organization learned from what it had just done, incorporated that learning, and became marginally better at the thing it existed to do. Every variable was examined. Every decision was surfaced and evaluated. Every moment where things had diverged from the plan, and there were always moments because plans and reality were always in negotiation, was identified and understood. The comms blackout got its own segment. Cross looked at Rodriguez when they reached it. Not with accusation, Cross was too experienced to assign blame to geology, but with the specific attention of a commander who needs to understand exactly what happened and how it was managed. "When did you recognize the blackout?" Cross asked. "Approximately 4 minutes after the neutralization call," Rodriguez said. "I attempted contact twice before confirming it was environmental, not equipment. And the decision to move it to contingency extraction," Rodriguez glanced at Ava for exactly 1/2 second. "It was brief enough that most of the room missed it. Hargrove didn't miss it. Cross didn't miss it. Joint decision," Rodriguez said. "Reynolds identified the contingency point timing correctly and the route correctly. We executed." Cross looked at Ava. "Walk me through your reasoning." She did. Clean linear, no editorializing the situation as it presented the options, as she assessed them, the decision as she made it, and why. The room listened with the quality of attention that people give to things they are actually learning from, rather than simply waiting for their turn to speak. When she finished, Cross was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's the correct call, every step." He looked around the table. "For the record, when comms go down in a hide, your first obligation is to the contingency plan, not to improvisation. Reynolds made that call immediately and correctly." He paused. "That's what we expect from everyone in this room." Nobody said anything, but Webb across the table caught Ava's eye for a brief moment and gave her a single nod. Small, unambiguous. The nod of a man who is watching someone receive acknowledgement they've earned and who is glad to be in the room when it happens. The debrief closed at 07:20. The team dispersed to their recovery routines. Food, sleep, the essential biological maintenance that sustained performance required, and the FOB shifted back into its daytime operational rhythm, the sun climbing, the temperature climbing with it, the desert doing its indifferent work of being large and hot and absolute. Ava went to the mess hall and ate alone, which was not unusual, in which she did not experience as loneliness. She had learned a long time ago that there was a difference between being alone and being lonely, and that the difference lived entirely in whether you were at peace with your own company. She was. She had worked at it for years the way you work at any skill, deliberately with honest attention to where you were falling short. She was halfway through her coffee when Hargrove sat down across from her. He did it without asking, which she noted and which she read not as rudeness, but as the specific social code of someone who has decided that asking would be a formality neither of them needed. He was a large man, not tall, but built with the particular density of someone who had maintained serious physical conditioning for 2 decades and whose body had simply incorporated it into its baseline. He had a face that had been lived in hard, the kind of face that collected experience visibly. And he had eyes that were, she had noticed very still, the eyes of someone who watched more than they spoke, which in her experience was usually the more trustworthy configuration. He put his own coffee on the table and looked at her. 22 years, he said. She waited. I've been doing this for 22 years. SEAL teams, task forces, 3 continents. More operations than I can give you a number for without going to my records. He drank. In 22 years, I have seen exactly 4 shooters who had what you have. She held his gaze. What do I have? He thought about it. Not performing thought, actually thinking the way people think when the answer matters and they want to get it right. Stillness, he said finally. Real stillness, not technique, not training. The thing underneath the training that the training is trying to reach. He paused. Most people, even good people, even excellent people, the stillness is something they build and maintain. It takes effort. You can see the effort if you know what you're looking at. He looked at her directly. Yours isn't built. It's just there. It's where you live. The mess hall moved around them. Someone dropped a tray somewhere behind her. A group of support personnel came through the line, loud and caffeinated and oblivious to everything happening at the corner table. She said, my father used to say that stillness was just honesty applied to the body. That when you got quiet enough, your body told you what was true, and the shot told you whether you'd listen. Hargrove absorbed this. Your father was a shooter. My father was a rancher, but out there those things weren't different. He nodded slowly. Tell me about him. It wasn't a question she'd been asked in an operational context before. People in this world asked about your quals, your experience, your previous assignments. They didn't ask about your father. But Hargrove asked it with the straightforward sincerity of someone who understood that people were not separable from where they came from, and that understanding where a person came from was part of understanding why they were exceptional. She told him. Not everything. She was not someone who gave everything at once to anyone but enough. The ranch, the distances, the rifles she'd grown up with before they were bigger than she was. Her father's patience, which was not the patience of a calm man, but of a deliberate one, a man who understood that some things took as long as they took, and that trying to accelerate them was how you ruined them. And your brother, Hargrove said, quietly, carefully. She stopped, looked at him. Rodriguez told me, he said, not as gossip, as context. He thought I should know. She sat with that for a moment. She wasn't angry. She had learned to calibrate her anger specifically to direct it at things that deserved it rather than things that merely surprised her. Rodriguez telling Hargrove was not a betrayal. It was a member of a team communicating relevant information to another member of the team. That was how teams functioned, and that was how people who were responsible for each other managed the weight of that responsibility. Daniel, she said. Yes, Hargrove said. He was steady, she said. It was the word she always used, the one that was truest. He was the steadiest person I've ever known, and I've known some steady people. She looked at her coffee cup. The shot that killed him came from 900 meters. The analyst who wrote the after action said it was likely a Taliban-trained Pakistani sniper. High-value specialist. She paused. I thought about that for a long time. The person on the other end of that shot. Who they were. What they had spent their life becoming. Another pause. And I decided that the answer to that was not rage. Rage doesn't have precision. The answer was to become better. To be the best version of the thing that killed him, but pointed in the right direction. Hargrove was quiet for a long time. Then he said, does it help? She looked at him. Does what help? Being the best version. Does it actually help? With the loss. She considered this with the honesty it deserved because Hargrove was asking it with the honesty it deserved, and she owed him a real answer rather than a clean one. Some days, she said, on the days when the shot is right, when everything I've built is working exactly the way it should, and the round goes exactly where Daniel's didn't, those days it helps. It feels like something. She paused. Other days it's just work, and work is enough. Work is what keeps you moving. Hargrove nodded. He understood this. She could see that he understood it in a way that came from personal experience and not from theory, which was the only way to truly understand it. Cross needs to hear that, he said. She looked at him sharply. Not your grief, he said quickly. your framework, the way you think about precision and purpose and what the work is for. He set his coffee down. Cross lost someone last year. Operator named Briggs, 29 years old, 3 tours exceptional by any measure. No warning, nothing anyone could have done differently. And Cross, he stopped. Cross has not been the same since. Not in any way that's visible to anyone who doesn't know him the way I know him. But I know him. And there's something in him since Briggs that's tighter, more brittle, the way metal gets when you've stressed it too many times. He looked at her. He needs to hear from someone who has built something productive out of loss, rather than just carrying it. She stared at him. You want me to talk to Cross about Briggs. I want you to talk to Cross about Daniel, and let Cross draw his own conclusions. I'm an Army Staff Sergeant Hargrove. He's a 2-star general. That's not a conversation that happens. It happened yesterday on the range, Hargrove said simply. It happened in the debrief this morning. The rank was there. The conversation happened anyway. He looked at her steadily. Cross respects you. That pin you wear against your chest, he knows what it means. You know what it means. Everything else is just organization chart. She sat back, looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at him. You're not subtle, she said. 22 years, he said. Subtle stopped working for me around year 7. She almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close enough that Hargrove saw it and recognized it for what it was, the outer edge of someone allowing themselves briefly and carefully to be amused by the world. I'll think about it, she said. That's all I'm asking, he said. He stood, picked up his coffee and paused. Reynolds, for what it's worth, what you did last night and what you did on that range and the way you handled every moment of the last 48 hours. He stopped, chose the words. You didn't just prove you belonged here. You raised the standard for what belonging here means. He said it simply, without ceremony, the way he said everything. And then he walked away. She sat alone in the mess hall and drank her coffee and thought about Briggs, whom she had never met, and about Daniel, whom she had loved completely, and about the strange, specific way that loss moved through people differently. Some it froze, some it broke, some it drove, some it quietly consumed, and about what Hargrove was really asking, which was not for her to counsel a general, but for her to be honest with one, which was a different thing and a harder one in its way. Cross found her at 1400. She was at the range, not shooting, cleaning. The M82 was broken down across the bench, and she was working through the barrel with the focused attention of someone who understood that the relationship between a shooter and their weapons was maintained not in the dramatic moments of use, but in the unglamorous repetitive work of care. Cleaning was the practice of respect. Her father had taught her that at 9 years old, and it had never stopped being true. Cross pulled a stool to the adjacent bench and sat down without announcing himself, which she heard and acknowledged with a brief look, and then returned to the barrel. He said nothing for almost 2 full minutes. She let the silence be what it was. Then he said, Hargrove told me what you said about Daniel. She stopped cleaning. Just for a moment. Then she resumed. He mentioned he might, she said. I'm sorry about your brother. 3 words before that, and then those 4, and the 4 were different from everything that had come before. They were personal in a way that Cross did not default to. And she heard the effort in them, which was not insincerity, but its opposite. The effort was the sincerity. Men like Cross did not reach for personal expression easily, and when they did, the reach cost them something. Thank you, sir, she said. A pause. Briggs, he said. She kept working. I know, sir. Hargrove has a large mouth. Hargrove has good judgment, she said. He decided I should know. I think he was right. Cross was quiet. She could feel him beside her, not his physical presence specifically, but the weight of what he was carrying, which Hargrove had named, in which she could now perceive the way you perceive something once it's been pointed out to you. The tightness, the brittleness of a thing that had been stressed in a specific place too many times. He was 29, Cross said. Daniel was 26, she said. Silence. The IED report said it was instantaneous, Cross said. They always say that, the reports, instantaneous, like that's supposed to be, he stopped, like that's supposed to be enough, she said. Yes, he said, just the one word with everything in it. She set down the cleaning rod and looked at him directly. This was, she had decided in the mess hall, the moment that required full attention, Not the range attention, not the operational attention, but the human attention that was harder to deploy for her than any of those, because it required lowering the discipline that protected her in order to actually reach another person. "Sir," she said, "can I tell you something that isn't rank appropriate?" He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted the command bearing relaxed not completely, but enough the way a door shifts in its frame without opening fully. "You have 48 hours of credit built up with me for things that weren't rank appropriate. Use it." "I was angry for 2 years after Daniel died," she said. "Not at the enemy, at myself, for being alive and skilled and trained, and none of it was there when he needed it." She paused. "I couldn't shoot accurately for 8 months. Not because I lost the physical skill. Because anger and precision don't share the same space. They're incompatible. Anger needs to expand. Precision needs to contract. You can't do both." Cross was very still. "8 months," she continued. "And then one morning I was on a range at Bragg, and I realized that the anger wasn't honoring him. It was just noise. And noise was exactly what killed him, the noise of a conflict he walked into and couldn't see all the edges of. And I decided that what I could do, what I specifically could do that almost nobody else could, was reduce the noise. In my little corner of this, make the thing I do so precise that it took noise out of the equation, as much as one person can." She picked up the cleaning rod again. "That's not redemption. I don't believe in redemption. That's just finding the thing that transforms the grief into something that works." Cross said nothing for a long moment. The range was quiet around them. The desert afternoon pressed against everything with its full weight. Somewhere in the distance, a helicopter moved across the sky with the particular sustained percussion of a Chinook and then was gone and the quiet came back. "Briggs liked this work," Cross said finally. He paused, not the violence of it, the precision, the planning, the way a good operation is like a mechanism, every part doing exactly what it's supposed to do. Nothing wasted, nothing unnecessary. He used to say that a clean operation was the most honest thing a person could do. He stopped. "I've been trying to figure out what to do with that since October." She nodded. "Keep building clean operations," she said. "That's what he'd recognize. That's what he'd want to be part of even now." Cross looked at her, and for the first time in the 48 hours she had known him, General Nathaniel Cross looked not like a commander, and not like a legend, and not like the most decorated SEAL in his generation. He looked like a man who was carrying something heavy and had just found unexpectedly that someone understood the weight of it. He stood up, straightened. The command bearing came back not as a wall this time, but as what it actually was, which was the posture of a man who had decided long ago that bearing was how you serve the people, depending on you, and who still believed that. "Reynolds," he said. "Sir, when this deployment ends your assignment with this element, what happens to you?" She had been told she'd return to SOCIOM, back to the cross-qualification evaluation program, back to the work of improving training pipelines and assessment standards, which was important and work necessary, work the kind of work that saved lives at several removes from any individual operation. She told him this. He nodded, slowly. "Then I'm going to make a call to Whitfield." She looked up at him. "Not to complain," he said, "to request, formally." He paused. "This element has a gap. I identified it in the briefing before you walked through that door. I identified it accurately. What I failed to identify accurately was where the solution to that gap would come from and what it would look like when it arrived." He held her gaze. "I don't make that mistake twice." She understood what he was saying. The understanding of it moved through her with a specific weight, not the weight of ambition, satisfied, not the weight of vindication, but something quieter than both. The weight of being seen correctly, fully, not as a curiosity or an anomaly or a political assignment or a woman who didn't belong, but as exactly what she was, a soldier who had spent her life building a specific and rare capability in service of a specific and real purpose, and who had brought that capability to exactly the right place. "Sir," she said, "I'd be honored." He nodded once, turned to leave, stopped. "Reynolds." "Sir." "The shot last night, 720 meters, moving target, night conditions." He paused. "I've been in this community for 31 years. I have seen..." Another pause. That was one of the finest single shots I have ever seen documented, and I have seen documentation of shots that belong in history. He said it without inflation, without the theatrical weight of someone delivering a compliment. He said it the way he said operational facts because to him, it was one. You should know that. She held his gaze. I know, sir, she said, not with arrogance, with the same simple honesty she brought to everything. The honesty of someone who had done the work and knew what the work produced and didn't require false modesty to dress the knowledge in. He almost smiled. It was as close as she had seen him come. Good, he said. Arrogance would have been disappointing, but false modesty would have been worse. He walked away. She sat alone at the range bench with the M82 components spread in front of her, and she looked at them for a long moment. Then she resumed cleaning, and the work moved through her hands the way it always did, familiar, exact, honest, and she thought about her father standing in the field behind the barn, watching her shoot and not correcting her anymore. Just watching. And she thought about Daniel, steady Daniel, who had walked into a conflict at 900 meters removed from someone who had learned what she had learned and who had not come back. And she thought about what remained when everything else was said and done, not the operations, not the credentials, not the acknowledgments from commanders who had doubted her, but the shot itself. The clean, honest, irreducible fact of the round going exactly where she sent it. That was what remained. That was always what remained. Rodriguez found her there an hour later, the rifle fully reassembled. The cleaning kit packed, the bench cleared with the same economy she brought to everything. Cross talked to you, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, she said, and oh, how fun, and he's calling Whitfield. Rodriguez sat down on the adjacent bench and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, you know what Hargrove said to me this morning after the debrief? What? He said, and I'm quoting exactly because it's Hargrove, and Hargrove is quotable, he said, in 22 years I have met 3 people who made me reconsider what possible means. She's the 4th. Rodriguez paused. Hargrove doesn't say things he doesn't mean. I know, she said. Does it land? Hearing it, she considered the question. It lands differently than I expected, she said. I spent so long preparing for doubt that I didn't fully prepare for the other thing. Acceptance, he said. Recognition, she corrected. They're not the same. Acceptance means they're letting you in despite what they thought. Recognition means they see what's actually there. She looked at him. Cross sees what's actually there. So does Hargrove. So do you. Rodriguez was quiet for a moment. Then that first night, the briefing room, when Cross pointed you at the door, I watched you. I watched the way you stood when he did that. He paused. Most people flinch, or they get hard. The defenses go up and they stay up. You didn't do either. I've been pointed at doors before, she said. I know. But it's not the experience of being pointed at doors that makes the difference. It's what you decide about the people who point. He looked at her directly. What did you decide about Cross in that moment? She thought about it honestly. That he was wrong, she said. Not bad, not cruel, or not only cruel, just wrong. And that wrong was fixable if I had the opportunity to fix it. And you did. And I did, she confirmed. Rodriguez stood, extended his hand. She looked at it. Then she took it, and they shook, not the perfunctory shake of professional courtesy, but the firm-held grip of 2 people who have been through something together and emerged from it with a specific regard for each other that had been built in real conditions and would not easily erode. It was an honor, Reynolds, he said, and Rodriguez, she said, same. He walked away, and she sat for one more moment in the quiet of the range in the afternoon heat of Kandahar. And she did what she always did when an operation was complete and the debrief was done, and the rifle was clean, and everything that needed to be said had been said. She got still. Not the shooting stillness, the deeper one, the Montana stillness, the one that lived underneath everything else that had been there since she was 9 years old, standing in a field with a rifle too big for her, learning that the world was large and honest and did not adjust for you, and that your only job was to become precise enough to meet it on its own terms. She had met it on its own terms. She had walked into a room where no one expected her, and she had stood her ground, and she had let her work speak with the only language that ever actually mattered, the clean, irrefutable physical truth of the shot. 1,600 meters on a range in the Kandahar Desert, 720 meters in a valley in the dark, and a room full of men who had looked at her and seen everything wrong, and who had done the thing that the best people do when confronted with the truth of their error. They adjusted and they admitted it and they became better. General Nathaniel Cross had grabbed her arm and pointed her toward a door. And then he had stood on a range and watched her make the impossible routine, and he had called Colonel Whitfield, and he had told him that the gap in his element had been filled. Staff Sergeant Ava Reynolds had not changed who she was from the moment she walked through that door to the moment she sat in the quiet of the range with her clean rifle and her father's stillness and her brother's name pressed against her chest in the weight of a pin. She had simply waited for the world to catch up to what was already true. And it had. It always does for the ones who are precise enough and patient enough and honest enough to hold their ground until it does. That was her father's lesson. That was Daniel's legacy. That was the shot, every shot, all of them, from the first one in Montana to the last one in Helmand and every one that would come after. Stillness, honesty, precision, and the absolute refusal to miss.